Andrew, are you able to hear us?
Yep, now I am. Why did you say something to me before?
Yeah, I was telling you some secrets and
I was just being an arrogant prick,
oh, oh.
which comes as no surprise, I'm sure.
I doubt that.
Sorry about that. I just got my volume turned up.
Oh. Good to see you, Jonathan. Everything okay?
Howdy. Yeah, we're good.
All right. I don't know if you looked at the email, Jonathan, but we had a couple people. Actually, Xavier, your dad, I think, is he running a race or something?
I believe his wife is, and he will be here as soon as they can.
Okay,
Okay.
okay.
Depending on how quickly he finishes the race.
Yes, exactly.
I If
Nice.
he finishes.
I have faith in him.
Uh, let's see. But Jonathan, John then posed a question to you in the email. If
Let
you
me take
run
a
out
look.
of
Oh yeah, here it is. Okay. All right. Very good. Hmm. Got a couple minutes, let people roll in here.
I don't think this podcast with Ryan is going to come off, Jonathan.
No, I don't think you're gonna get him to do it. You and I will make it happen.
uh,
I gotta look at my calendar and figure out when I can swing it.
well, I'll leave it to you with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he may. I'm sure he's busy with his new job.
Well, he is. Well, and he's part of what's going on is he's got his new job, and then on top of that, he's doing some he's volunteering with a local civil society organization in the Twin Cities, and I think it's keeping him busy. Um, but and God bless him. You know.
Yeah, he keeps his hand in everything. Even when he was at school, I was surprised at all the various. He was coming around collecting all of our non-burnable garbage. He started his own recycling program, I think.
Sounds right. That's the ring of truth. I'm gonna close these drapes behind me because otherwise that light will the lens flare on my computer camera here.
Joel, I've been hearing from KHO all day, and he's playing out your list.
Very good.
He sends me a picture from each new place that he's gone. He said the Mac burger was the best burger he's ever had. So
Okay. Well, here we can get going. Looks like folks are rolling in. We got most of everybody here. So the very first thing I want to do is you know, one of the two things I sort of wanted for this the unfolding of this course, and one was to by going through this series of excerpts from Lonergan to give a little bit of a flavor of how he understood the challenge of um, the doing something that he thought was of the essence of the ongoing life of the church, which is to engage whatever culture the church finds itself in, um, to be able to answer the questions generated by the efforts of people in that who live in that culture, to live the gospel. And that's really how he thinks of theology in general, right? Is as this department of any whatever given culture one happens to be in that reflectively tries to address the intellectual challenges posed by the effort to live the gospel in that time and in that place. And his view um, of the stretch of time between Vatican I and Vatican II in the Catholic Church is that, for as much as today, in common parlance, at least if you're in these circles, if you're talking about someone who's a traditionalist, especially a sort of as rad trad as they call them, a radical traditionalist, um, right? The expression of church life that those folks seem to have a yen for is a pre-Vatican II, but post-Vatican I window. And Lonergan's criticism is interesting. I made this point in another class, but it's worth revisiting, right? Is that actually this time period of what he saw as overweening anti-modernism, um, which is not to say that he didn't think there are things in modernity to criticize, nor did he think that there wasn't a kind of um, mentality properly called modernism in the pejorative sense, but that there was a kind of overweening anti-modernism that kept the church from doing what it had traditionally done in previous periods of its life, which is to engage the culture in a fruitful way. Um, and so he thinks there's a kind of belated opportunity to face up to the challenge of figuring out what it means for the church to engage and to, in his word, Christianize modern culture. And part of doing that is to engage and Christianize um, what he calls the cultural superstructure, which is to say, to generate a theology that's at the intellectual level of the culture. Um, and so, partly, I wanted the course to give you some sense of the parameters of that challenge as he saw them. Um, but then also I wanted it to be a kind of preparation for if you want to go on and read method and theology, I wanted those of you who hung in with us to be able to show up to method and theology with some sense of the topics and problems and questions that Lonergan was engaged with on his way to the publication of method, so that you have some idea of where method comes from. Um, we didn't read the introduction to method here. I dumped you right into the first chapter on method in the book Method and Theology. And as you can tell, I mean, the introduction doesn't give you much more. He throws you right into his theory of what a method is, which we'll talk about today. But there's not a lot. He gives you 3 paragraphs of setup for what we're doing here. You don't get, it's not, Gadamer, if you read Truth and Method, the first half of Gadamer's book is just the history of hermeneutics. It goes on and on and on. And if you're not interested in the historical, if you just want to be like, Gadamer, tell me what you think about how, you know, uh, truth operates in your hermeneutical philosophy, you've got 350 pages of setup you have to get through in that book. Lonergan does not do that. Um, Part of that, I think I've mentioned before, is a biographical um, factor that he had had surgery for lung cancer that nearly killed him, and he was under what turned out to be the mistaken impression that he didn't have a lot longer to live. He ended up living another decade and a half, but he thought he would have less than a third of that. And so part of it is he's just trying to get the book out. Um, but but in any case, so those are the two goals really. I want you to have a sense of how he saw the challenge of Christian theology participating in the Christianization of modern culture. Um, and then also to have a kind of ramp up into reading method and theology if that's something you want to do. Um, So yeah, so I want to look at, because it's important to get this. And I want to get into your questions too, as always, but I just want to take a minute to draw your attention to something here. Um, in the PDF, on the second page of the PDF, page 8 of the book, down at the bottom, uh, Lonergan just gives you a definition of what he's talking about when he's talking about a method. And uh it's precise. So sorry here. I was gonna give Paul a second to pull it up. So good. This right here. This is what we're looking at. A method is a normative pattern. Every word here matters. A method is a normative pattern of recurrent and related operations yielding cumulative and progressive results. There is a method then where there are distinct operations, where each operation is related to the others, where the set of relations forms a pattern, where the pattern is, and this is what he means by normative, is described as the right way of doing the job, where operations in accord with the pattern may be repeated indefinitely, so that's the recurrent part, and where the fruits of such repetition are not repetitious fruits, but cumulative and progressive fruits. So it goes somewhere. So this is the topic of this course, right, about progress in theology. Um, One of the ways in which uh, Lonergan is answering the question of how can there be progress in theology is to set out, as he does in this chapter, the normative pattern of recurrent and related operations that will yield progress in theology. Let me say that again because it's very compact. To address the question of whether and how there can be progress in theology, and not denying there are other factors, he's spelling out one essential and ineluctable, unremovable element is that if you can spell out what the normative and recurrent pattern of related operations is that yields progressive results in any field of inquiry, then um, it will give you at least one element that is the key to making progress in theology specifically. So that's the strategy for the book. Now he's going to derive in subsequent chapters, in addition to what he gives you here, which is this general transcendental method, right? The method that will yield cumulative and progressive results no matter what field of inquiry you're engaged in. He's going to also provide a number of in subsequent chapters the elements you need to add on to the basic general transcendental method to specify it to the particular demands of theology. So he will give you an account of the human good. He'll give you an account of how he thinks about the religious phenomena in general. He will give you an account of uh, the various functions and realms and stages of meaning. Meaning, as we've talked about before, is a really important thing for Lonergan to objectify and to thematize the mediating and constituting function of meaning in human life. And he thinks that's as true in religion, and so then in theology as it is in any other area of human living. Um, so he's going to complicate things further as you get further into the book, but this is really as he says, right, this is the rock on which everything else can be built. Is if theology is going to yield cumulative and progressive results, then you need to know what's the kind of core um, core normative pattern of operations. Um, and it's going to consist in this kind of self-assembling structure. He calls it a formally dynamic structure. It's formally dynamic in that it assembles itself and it does it through activity um, of attentiveness and intelligence and reasonableness and responsibility. Um, so yeah, maybe I'll stop there. Maybe that's enough to give you some sense of where this is going to fit into both the rest of the book and also somewhat how it connects to what we've talked about so far. And maybe I'll pump the brakes and we can pivot to your questions. Or if my little spiel here at the beginning has occasioned a question directly on that, maybe we can prioritize those too if that has happened.
A question came up for me when you were describing how Lonergan wants to Christianize the culture or the superstructure of the culture. And I'm at once interested in like things like the death penalty being revoked, like these sort of like Christian insights,
Mhm.
but also don't want it to be like hegemonic in how we go about the business of like we
Yeah.
don't need to be colonial. So like how do you do one and not the other, I guess? Is this just like a
Yeah.
personal, um, small communal effort, or yeah, does he get into that somewhere?
Uh, no, no, he doesn't. Um, but the if you want to look if you want a good example of somebody who does, my teacher, excuse me, at Marquette, a guy named Father Joseph Ogbonnaya, 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 is Igbo Nigerian, and he's a Lonergan scholar. He studied with Bob Doran and John Dudosky too. He did his doctorate at University of Toronto. Um, but Joseph writes a lot about the enculturation of Catholicism specifically and Christianity generally in um, post-colonial Africa. And he's really convinced that Lonergan is the sort of theoretician of how to reflect in a scholarly way and theological way on the 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 basic kind of skeletal outlines of the enculturation of the faith in the indigenous culture of a place, or as he likes to call it, the autochthonous culture of a place, which means the same thing. Um, and uh, and part of what that means is the recognition. In my book about the divine concursus, about the cooperation between human action, human agents, and God's agency, and the function of meaning in that cooperation, um, is the recognition that you know discerning divine meaning is always has to happen um, in and through the expressiveness of human meaning. Uh, and because God is always already acting in every human action, including acts of meaning, um, every authentic expression of human meaning is a suitable and available vessel for the communication of divine meaning. Um, and uh, because De Verbum tells us that the Word of God is in the first instance a person, um, which is to say a subject, right? A self. Um, that that identity can be communicated. Uh, well, if Eugene Gendlin is right, the psychologist and philosopher, um, that identity can be communicated through an infinite variety of meanings. And so what one has, but not, but at the same time, not any and every meaning. And so uh, there is needed Christian discernment in cooperation with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, to discern how it is that the gospel is to be aptly enculturated in the varieties of cultures across geography and also through time. Notice that this is that the missionary problem is a synchronic lateral version of what Lonergan has mostly thematized in terms of the diachronic problem of different cultures down the ages, so to speak, right? Lonergan talks about sort of the shift from the sort of Hellenistic um, engagement, the engagement with Hellenistic culture, and then medieval culture, and then Renaissance culture, and now modern culture. Um, but that's a kind of diachronic set of problems of changing cultures. But you can also change cultures by just going to other places, um, which the European colonizers did and brought Christianity with them. Uh, and so, one of the things too that Joseph Ogmaniah is tuned into is the way in which um, indigenous African culture now includes Christianity because of the missionary enterprises and their sort of riding on the back of colonization. Um, and so it's not like uh, the fostering the religious autonomy of, for example, Nigerian people, um, does not mean trying to get back behind the introduction of Christianity into sub-Saharan Africa. It's there now, and people are born into a culture that um, has has Christianity shot through it. And so the question then becomes one about um, can that culture and the Christian living that happens within that culture become more authentic than it has been in the past? Um, or will past inauthenticities continue to dominate, right? Will the confusion of um, Western modes of social organization with Christian, with the Christian message, right? Will that continue and that kind of thing? Or the identification only of, in so many places, the identification of Western languages with Christianity and the suppression of indigenous languages, right? Those are all, um, it's easy for us now, I think, to see how stupid those things were. But in a culture where, where the horizon that's set out by that culture is constrained by the inauthenticity of its moral failings, it's not easy to notice how stupid. So anyway, I'm wandering all over the place on the topic, but yeah, it's a whole enormous question, and then there are Lonergan scholars who work on it. Another person who's good is also Nigerian. He's from the other side of Nigeria, from Joseph. Cyril Orji, Orji, who is, I think, at Dayton. I'm pretty sure. Um, and he also works on this. He is not only a Lonergan person, but he also uses Peirce. So if you like pragmatism, Cyril uses Peirce a lot as well. Good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Don, or Andrew.
Yeah, can I just maybe just ask you a little bit further about that? At the end of section 2, right, he gives out the and I don't have the page, forgive me, because I'm referring to a book, not the PDF. I apologize. But at the end of section 2, right before transcendental methods, section 3, he says that the doubly dynamic pattern is be attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible, right? And then added later or elsewhere, loving, right? So that isn't that, I mean, that's the sort of, it strikes me, or to what degree is that part of the answer to Patrick then,
Yeah.
right? Is that we have to be loving. It's not sufficient to be attentive, to be intelligent, to be
Yeah.
right. So I'm not
Yeah, yeah.
saying I don't
No,
mean that in a naive way, but that there's well, anyway.
no, I hear you. I mean, so the difficulty is with the way Lonergan sets that out, um, is falling in love, the way Lonergan talks about it in chapter 4 of Method. Being in love, which he hyphenates, right? Which he talks about as a dynamic state. So it endures through time, but it's also it's manifest in activity. Um, the the first level at which it operates is at the level of existential responsibility, and so it really pertains to liberty. Um, and so in the first instance, the way Lonergan thinks about being in love in this transcendent way, well, really in a religious way, he quotes Romans 5:5, the love of God poured into our hearts by the gift of the Holy Spirit. Um, the first manifestation of the operativity of this being in love, this being uh, he uses Tillich's language at one point of sort of being grasped by ultimate concern, is at the level of liberty. And so it really has to do with what in insight he calls willingness. Um, that things which before you would not have been willing to do, now you will be willing to do. And the example I always use is of, someone who's fallen in love and who says to their beloved, "Baby, for you, anything," right? That the restrictions on your will, what in insight is called antecedent willingness, are removed. And so, out of this love, there's nothing you won't do, including in conformity to Christ, be tortured to death um, publicly, which is a pretty radical expansion of willingness. Right, and when you look at the Christian tradition, right, it's part of why martyrdom is seen as a kind of automatic sign of sanctity. And still in the Catholic Church, right, the martyrs, the sanctity of martyrs is recognized more or less immediately, because that's kind of the Christianity sees that as the limit case of freedom in Christ. That you're willing to, what does it say in Acts, suffer for the name. Um, and so, however, I might have a profound transformation of my antecedent willingness because I've been grasped by God's love and I'm willing to go where that love leads. So I cooperate, to use the Thomist and Augustinian language, right? I cooperate with the operation of God's grace. However, I am still a historical creature. And so the realization, the concretization of that willingness in my behavior has to be mediated by and constituted by really um, a set of meanings, which means that there's a whole set of um, judgments that need to happen. But in order for judgments to happen, there have to be certain insights. And for there to be certain insights, certain questions have to get asked. And for certain questions to arise, there have to be certain experiences. Um, and so you can think of someone who comes from a dysfunctional family and they go out into the world, they get out of their family system and they go out into the world and they meet somebody and they really genuinely fall in love. They're just walloped by falling in love with somebody. Um, and the frustration that can emerge out of that, which is that, man, I really love this person and I keep finding myself treating them like shit. Why?
Just for the record, I don't have to imagine that. That's not.
Just hypothetically, someone I met once. Um, right? They encounter though the willingness is there, right? The concrete constitutive meanings in terms of incarnate meanings of a way of being a person aren't online yet. And so like you still got to go to the therapist, right? And go as the kids say on Tumblr, do the work. Um, and so that's a very small interpersonal example, but at the level of the encounter of civilizations, um, right? It might be that uh, you have the willingness to endure terrific dangers, right? To get on a fucking boat and go wherever, and risk having strange people see you as a stranger and kill you before you ever get a word of the gospel out of your mouth, as happens to no shortage of missionaries. Um, and yet the cultural resources may not be there to be able to show up. And though you are grasped by love and propelled by love, you can still show up, and your ability to live lovingly are confounded by the diminishments of your culture. Um, so I did when I was undergraduate, I did a semester in Australia. I was in Sydney, and I took a course in Australian anthropology, and I learned a lot about the colonization of Australia and tragic. I mean, really, tragic, disturbing stuff. And going as an American and knowing about the colonization of of what would become the United States, and seeing this kind of, in some ways, an amplified version of what happened here happened there and happened 100 years later. It's pretty disturbing, but fascinating. And one of the things that happened with both Anglican and Catholic missionaries in Australia is that they would show up and they'd set up these missions. And one thing they would do is, thinking they were helping kids, they'd take kids away from their parents, and raise them in a kind of, Anglo way. But another thing they did, was that they had a kind of whole cultural imaginary about stages of civilization, and there had a theory that maybe there had once been a real civilization, quote unquote, real civilization here in Australia, but that these were um, these were sort of human populations, that their culture and their civilization was dying, that they had encountered this population that was kind of at the end of its collective lifespan. And so they set up their missions, essentially as hospice for an entire culture, um, to just kind of provide comfort on their way out. Um, Now that's stunningly wrong, um, but nevertheless, right? Those were the cultural ideas that were online, and so people who had goodwill, who were trying to live out the love that propelled them to travel so far away to maybe never ever go home to England or Ireland again. Um, right. We're in well, later in Method and Theology, Lonergan will make a distinction between major and minor authenticity, right? They had a kind of minor authenticity relative to their own culture, right? They weren't driving Aboriginal people off of cliffs into the ocean like the people who wanted to have ranches did, or giving them smallpox blankets. Um, but they still lacked the major authenticity that could see the misapprehensions that their cultural resources were leading them to, and so the mistreatment that they perpetrated as a result.
But
Um,
doesn't that suggest, I mean, because I mean, when you start talking about civilization and culture, right, there's obviously a level of abstraction to that. And so that to live out part of the living out of what you're describing as sort of civilizational or cultural things is that you are no longer being attentive, intelligent, reasonable, or responsible. That it's undermining or blocking and certainly not loving, right? But that it's that those abstractions are preventing you from doing following the level, excuse me, the order of operations that resulted in these, in these initial, right? It has to be self-correcting in some way, right?
Yeah. In another context, you could
I
advert.
mean, so I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but
No,
just
no, go ahead.
no, sorry, I'll stop making solipsistic jokes. But that the uh I lost it. All right,
It's
sorry.
okay. So what I was going to say is, in another context, you had the debate between Bartolomé de las Casas and what was Sepulveda's first name? Anyway, it doesn't matter, right? You have this kind of legal debate about the rights of the indigenous people and the moral rectitude of enslaving them. Um, right? So you do have people who are raising these questions and who are trying to provide ways of expressing an understanding that will help avoid these moral horrors. And but yeah, if to advert back to the Australian context, uh, yeah, what you have is, there's all kinds of data in Aboriginal living in Australia on the sophistication of their community's culture to guide their way of life, um, and the chauvinism of primarily British settlers made it so they were obtuse to it, right? They didn't notice the data that was available on those cultural meanings and values in Aboriginal living. And so because they didn't notice the data, they didn't ask the question. They maybe weren't that interested in asking the question. Um, and so they didn't learn. And one of the payoffs of that, interestingly enough, in contemporary Australian life, is that part of the reason that Aboriginal social structures didn't very much resemble Western European social structures is because the kinds of agriculture that can be supported in the climate of Western Europe, it just can't be sustained without enormous artificial technological intervention in Australia. And still, everything just catches on fire periodically and destroys tons of cropland. Um, and so there was a whole body of wisdom, and I mean, it continues to be a body of wisdom in Aboriginal living, and shot through an Aboriginal culture, um, in its art. I don't know if you know this about Aboriginal art, at least on the east coast of Australia. It's done often with different colored sand and things like this, and it's done on the ground. And sometimes it's done with pigments on rocks, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. But the art is a depiction of the land from like a bird's eye view. Um, and it's stunningly accurate, these artistic recreations of the topographical features of the region from a bird's eye view that are reconstructions based on just walking the land and communicating it amongst the people in the group. Another cool thing about Aboriginal culture, just while I'm on it, is there's a lot of didgeridoo music isn't structured. The rhythms of didgeridoo music aren't structured mathematically; they're structured verbally. And so the rhythms in didgeridoo music are structured around the syllable structure of Aboriginal words, and not mathematical subdivision. Really interesting. Um, anyway, right? And so the settlers show up and they don't know any of this shit because they're not paying attention, right? They're not paying attention. They're not asking. They're assuming they already know and know better. And so that prevents, like you said, the self-correction that could make, though it has not, right, as time has gone on. The woman who taught my Australian anthropology class uh, was an Indian woman educated in London who now taught at a university in Sydney. So it's not like these aren't Foucauldian impenetrable epistemes, um, right? Because cultures are made up of intelligibilities, judgments, and evaluations. Um, you can learn them. And thank God, at least some people have, outside of the Aboriginal communities themselves, have learned these things, have been interested enough in them, And some of the um, the real cultural and other forms of oppression that the Aboriginal community has endured have been mitigated, um, though not enough, and certainly not certainly belatedly. But in any case, yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit of a long-winded way of trying to concretize what you're saying about the transcendental precepts, right? That yeah, um, the failures to take cognizance of those things are at root failures to adhere to the normativity of transcendental method, and the recovery from those oversights is by going along with the normative thrust of transcendental method. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mike,
Hey, everybody.
howdy.
So, would it be fair to say then that, like, he'll talk about the infrastructure and the superstructure being the cultural, whatever, situation and tools at our disposal, whatever, to articulate the infrastructure, where the infrastructure is operative grace, piercing and overflowing our hearts and reorienting and revitalizing sort of our whole cognitional, volitional dynamic, as people, right? There's that thing going on. And as long as your reach is exceeding your grasp of that, like you're oriented toward this mystery, you're okay. You know what I'm saying? Like you have the chance of at least being authentic in a minor sense.
Or anyway, you're getting less bad.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Right. You're perhaps withdrawing from inauthenticity or whatever.
Right.
But the infrastructure, the moment you articulate that inner word for you, as I'm doing right now, right, or any of us is, we're suddenly participating in the culture of our times, or parts of the culture of our times, the English language, for instance. And so there will always be sort of a weird discrepancy. There'll be these times when they coincide and it's lovely. And then there's always the risk that they don't. And so there's sort of a humility that has to go along with the confidence that comes with love flooding your heart. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, and I think the account that saints give of their sense of themselves and the way in which it's marked by humility, I think is indicative of that, right? That that there's a one is in one's insofar as one's willingness is transformed by grace. Yeah, you can turn outward and think about what I would do, what I'm willing to do with regard to my world, and even how much of my world I'm willing to take cognizance of. But there's also a turning in on oneself, right? There's a willingness to see the truth about oneself. There's a willingness to be honest about oneself. There's a willingness to address things about oneself. Um, that is also part of that transformation of antecedent willingness. And so, right, for us schmucks on the outside, we can go, man, that person's really holy, and they go, I mean, yeah, maybe some of the superficial unholiness has been mopped up, but I have this window on the deeper unholiness, and buddy, let me tell you, it's a whole other thing, right? And you're like, man, you're a saint, and that's your feeling about yourself, and because they've sort of had the aperture opened, um, yeah, there's gonna be that humility, and I think that's borne out in the literature of sort of saints' accounts of their own experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. So the thing in this that I had the hardest time with was he uses the word object in this essay a lot, in this chapter a lot, and he talks about this idea of objectification of consciousness.
Mhm.
And that is something that I just like. I have a very extremely negative reaction to that, like immediately. But when you were just talking about like this the humble attitude of the saint. Is that connected in some way to what he's trying to what he's trying to signify here? Talking about objectification of consciousness, is there a connection between that and the notion of humility that might help me see it in a different light? Because my
Good,
my
yeah.
initial reaction is like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it's not so yeah, so the very first thing to be said about his discussion of objectification here is that he means throughout this whole chapter he means object in a fairly refined phenomenological sense. Um, he means the noema. He means that he means the term of conscious acts that are made present to the subject by means of the act, right? So it's object in that sense. Um, he has a whole treatment of the ambiguities around the term object in Insight that you can go check out if you want. He does a pretty good job with it too in the lectures on insight, understanding, and being. I think it's in the first lecture in there. So if you want him to sort of tease out the senses in which one might mean object and get some clarity about the different ways in which he uses it, you can go look there. Um, but yes, I think you're right to catch that as a sense of objectification, right? Where um, all of us walking around are conscious in the bare sense that he means conscious, right? We're awake and aware and present to the data, all the data we have on being ourselves. Um, it's experienced in that really basic sense of it is the example I use with my students when I'm teaching because I'm often in these I don't know what happened to classrooms, but they seem to have become these just soul-sucking inhuman spaces with fluorescent light and loud HVAC systems and whiteboards, which I sort of also hate because apparently I have a Luddite streak. But inevitably we'll be in some one of these awful classrooms, and I will say, you've been hearing the HVAC system rattle and hum this whole class, but you didn't pay attention to it until just now, right? And so in some ways, right, the focal direction of attention is a kind of active objectification, right? It picks out, it intends the data given in one's experiencing in some determinate frame, and lets other things drop out of focus. And and so there are data, Lonergan. This is what Lonergan in Insight means the generalized empirical method, right? It's which is an earlier version of the same idea of transcendental method. So he calls it transcendental method here. In Insight, he calls it generalized empirical method. And the generality of generalized empirical method has to do with the inclusion not just of the data of sensitive intending, but also the data of consciousness on the intending acts themselves, that you also experience the act as well as that which the act makes present to you, which is to say the object. However, if you draw your attention to the data on the intending acts, now you are making the intending acts the object of an intentional act. You are objectifying in that sense. Um, and so too, then, right, if you try to draw attention to the subject who is the operator of those intending operations, you are objectifying the subject. You're making it the term of an act, an intentional act, rather than the operator of the intentional act. Um, and at some level, that's all he means by objectification and all he means by object is this very heuristic phenomenological sense of there's an operator, there's operations, and then there's the object of the operations. Um, but on another level, right, what not here, but in some other places he talks about as self-appropriation, right, is well, look, if the normativity of the patterned of operations, which is to say the method, um, is embedded in the the patterning in the process, um, then one way of knowing if I'm headed in the right direction, yeah, you can get some feedback about whether you're headed in the right direction from the stuff you're investigating, but you can also check in if you're headed in the right direction by giving some attention to your operating, right? Am I being obtuse to some set of data, right? Am I being inattentive? Am I is there some set of questions I'm not asking that I should be asking, right? Have I had the idea that makes all this hold together yet or not, or is it still just kind of loosey goosey? Um, right? Have I been able to determine if my way of thinking about this is correct or not, or probably correct or probably incorrect, or I just don't have any idea at this point, right? Making the operation, the activity itself, an object of your attention and of inquiry can be a way of checking on whether I'm making progress, right? Whether I'm headed in the right direction. Now, when we talk about the saint, we're talking about that in the religious life and in the moral life. But in one's intellectual life, that's true as well. Um, I know, I've maybe forgive me if I've given this example before, but it's what always comes up for me. I notice it when I'm writing, when I'm trying to write an article or something, or um, I'm trying to draft something. If I notice that it's not going very well, sometimes I can do it at the level of the prose and the ideas and stuff. But more often than not, I'll notice that the reason it's not going well is because I'm writing out of the wrong psychological posture. I'm anxious about what the reader is going to think. I'm protecting some sense of self, right? I'm writing out of some kind of sense of inadequacy or defensiveness, or there's something up in the posture of my subjectivity that's making me spin my wheels trying to say what I'm trying to say. And so that's a way of objectifying my own conscious, what is subjective, of objectifying it, as a way of checking in on, okay, why isn't this going well? Um, sorry, I was going to stop there because I've been talking for too long, but I did want to add one thing. When he talks about that the different levels in the process, in the pattern, each have a different quality to them. The consciousness itself has a different quality. Um, I've really, until recently, had underappreciated that. Um, I really do think that if you get a little practice at trying to check in on the subjectivity that's operating, to try and pivot back and forth between the object of what you're working on intellectually or morally, and check in on the sort of status of your subjectivity, um, there is a way in which uh, you can get familiar with the quality of consciousness that goes with the different levels. And so it can become a kind of shorthand where you can kind of go, does the way that I'm conscious right now, the quality of my being conscious, have the right feel to it for what I'm trying to do? And if it doesn't, maybe it's because I'm somewhere else, right? I'm ill disposed subjectively to whatever this thing is I'm trying to do on the objective side. Um, okay, that was a whole bunch.
Yeah, so essentially he just means like self-awareness. So your awareness of your awareness.
Yeah.
So
But he's worried about um, people misunderstanding what he means by how you become aware of your awareness.
mm.
Which is one of the things that I am hoping to at some point do more work on is, and somebody asked about contemplative prayer last time. Maybe it was John.
Yeah, that's actually where my mind was going while you were talking, because I think that's actually like contemplative prayer is actually an example of that of what he's trying to describe in operation, I
It's
think.
a technique for it's a technique of interior attention.
Yeah.
Um, and so I actually have a whole book project that I've been sort of for years, a few years in a row now, trying to get off the ground that I have not succeeded in doing so. But the project basically is to talk about the integration of contemplative prayer with scholarly methods, precisely because if the norm, if a core norm of cumulative progress in scholarly disciplines is going to be um, an authentic interiority, an authentic subjectivity, then there needs to be some techniques for adverting to the quality of subjectivity at play. And yeah, I think, the contemplative traditions have, in their various subtle different ways, resources for helping people get practiced at checking in with the quality of their subjectivity, of their interior life.
Will you get that book written and then we'll all come together again, please?
Gosh, I'll do my best. Um, I'll do my best.
Thank you for your answer. Appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. Did it help with your
Yeah, because
allergy
I
to
had the
object
yeah,
language?
exactly. It's like I knew that here there was something there that like I could relate to, but that like the language was like the way he was expressing it was causing a barrier for me. But I suspected there was something more there, which is why I wanted to ask the question.
This is a really common problem for people um who've worked with Gadamer first and then come to Lonergan. Is Lonergan's using a lot of the same words that Gadamer's using, but to mean almost exactly the opposite things. So, like, what Gadamer means by method is precisely not what Lonergan means by method. What Lonergan means by objectification and objectivity is almost exactly not what Gadamer means by objectivity and objectification. So you're not alone on that one. It's a Kevin Hughes at Villanova, and I always have to kind of go around on this, and I have to remind him when I'm doing kind of Lonerganese, I have to go. You got to remember, I know you got him, or you got Gadamer first, and so it makes you think when I say these words, I mean these things, but I mean like almost exactly the opposite. Yeah, it's challenging. Good. Other questions?
So, kind of related to, I really like the idea of combining contemplative prayer with scholarly practice. So, one of the ones I was thinking is, um, it seems like he's kind of setting out here a sort of universal transcendental method that would penetrate all disciplines. But I'm wondering, um, Nate will remember this. John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist I brought up a few times, has talked about how starting with Descartes, in some sense, he tries to come up with a kind of automatic, logical method that doesn't require um, perhaps anything other than kind of adherence to logic. So including like responsibility or perhaps these other qualities. In his increasingly pluralist context in the emerging modern world. So with Descartes trying to come up with a universal method that kind of, in some sense, extracts the person from the equation of thinking,
Yeah.
the key would be insofar as there's now no need of personal transformation to grasp certain truths, whereas that was previously sort of much more well known, like even Dante or something. So I'm wondering, would Lonergan agree with that critique of at least the kind of used very broadly the Cartesian method in the sense that it's a kind of universal, like guaranteed method to come to know certain truths, regardless of personal uh, spiritual development or transformation necessary for that. Because I know he does say you can't, uh, neither discovery or synthesis can be guaranteed by rules. I think he says,
Yep.
but that's not quite the same thing. And then the last thing was, it just reminded me of Balthazar talking about how theology should be done on one's knees, that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think so. Let's look at the very bottom of page 9, top of page 10, which in the PDF is the third page onto the fourth. I'll give Paul a chance to pull it up if he can. All right, so he's really talking about this issue here. Um, Method is often conceived as a set of rules that, even when followed blindly by anyone, in another place he says, even if followed by an idiot, nonetheless yield satisfactory results. I should grant that method so conceived is possible when the same result is produced over and over. Right? So there are methods in in math where right all you're doing is you're plugging in different values, but if you use this technique, you'll always get the correct um, sum if you kind of do the calculations that way. Um, but it will not do if progressive and cumulative results are expected. Results are progressive only if there is a sustained succession of discoveries. They are cumulative only if there is effected a synthesis of each new insight with all previous valid insights. But neither discovery nor synthesis is at the beck and call of any set of rules, logical rules included. Their occurrence follows statistical laws. They can be made more probable, right? That's part of how Lonergan thinks of what method is doing, is it's helping to kind of accumulate the probabilities um, that you'll be able to make either particular new discoveries or new synthetic discoveries. Um, but they cannot be assured by a set of prescriptions. So yeah, I mean, if yeah, if the way that we're going to deal with um, fragmentation is to have a kind of rarefied area in which there are a set of basic, universal, and necessary logical operations that will guarantee results. In that way, Descartes, for as much as he is, the grandfather of modernity in so many ways, there's still kind of a classical or medieval ideal operating, a logical ideal of how science should operate. It's, people have called it foundationalist if you want. I think it's probably not a terrible way of describing it. And here, rather, you have a much more significant kind of openness, which is we need new discoveries and we need those discoveries to aggregate and to coalesce into a point where we can sufficiently synthesize them into kind of a scheme or a view, a paradigm, if you like your Thomas Kuhn. And neither the discoveries nor the synthesis can be generated by sort of deducting what's implicit in a set of premises. You got to kind of arrange the data and the questions and your past knowledge into the right constellation and kind of hope the light bulb goes on. And you can make it more or less likely that the light. I mean, this is good teaching versus bad teaching. Good teaching should um, make it probable in a classroom that most of people's light bulbs will go on. And bad teaching fails to raise the probability. And so, when it comes test time, everybody fails. Um, that's really the measure. But you can't force anybody to learn anything. If they're not curious, certainly they're not going to learn. But even if they are curious, they can just not get it. It can just be that the light bulb doesn't go on, and you can't. There's no mechanistic or mechanical or automatic process that can force it. Um, and that's what Lonergan means when it says that insight is spontaneous. Um, and so what method is trying to do, what transcendental method does is create a structure to help raise the probability that those light bulbs go on, and also that they go on in an order that's headed somewhere. Um, yeah, but no, yeah, I think you're right to touch on that kind of model, that kind of I don't know Descartes well enough to know if that's a fair critique of Descartes, but to the extent it describes a mentality, yeah, I think it's fair to say Lonergan would share that criticism.
So that his talking about the probabilities rather than guaranteed from rules, you think that would be implied that you could furthermore state that it also may require, not just intellectual um, insight or the four levels where he said um, experience or attentiveness, um, all the way to responsibility, those four, but also potential transformation at the moral or
Yes.
spiritual levels,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
love.
good. So later on in the same book, in this book, he's going to thematize three basic kinds of transformation that are important. Um, he calls them conversions. Uh, there's intellectual conversion, moral conversion, and religious conversion. Um, he treats of them in that or ascending order, but he says in the concrete case, very often they emerge in the opposite order. Um, that one experiences the love of God being poured into their heart, and so it has the transformation, what I call the transformation of antecedent willingness. Um, this makes them open to previously unavailable kinds of responsible behavior. And so, you stay up late reading your textbook instead of playing video games. Um, and then out of that behavior comes the the insight into the human mind that results in intellectual conversion, which is really that for him intellectual conversion is about uh, living in a horizon where the criterion of the real is rationally verified intelligibility and not uh, what he calls the biological criterion, which is can I put my paw on it? Can I eat it? Can I have sex with it? Um, is it kind of out there? Uh, right. That's one of the things Descartes struggles with. Descartes is a dualist in part because he can't relinquish this extroverted criterion of reality. And so, yeah, there's res cogitans, but there's also res extensa. And he can never quite figure out how to make them both occupy the same universe um, in a coherent way. And Lonergan would say to Descartes on that point, well, buddy, here's the problem. You've got two criteria of reality operating that are incommensurable. Um, and and so, um, there has to be a kind of periagoge. There has to be a turning around. You got to turn your back on one criteria in order to hew to the other. Um, and same thing with the moral conversion. For Lonergan, moral conversion is about, um, it's about the criterion of what's good. Is the good that which is pleasurable or satisfying, or is the good that which is judged to be worthwhile in a judgment of value? Right? Is it genuinely a good thing in the objective sense and not just something I like? Um, and religious conversion again is also a turning in the sense that it is an encounter with God's love and a decision to accept it or not accept it, to open oneself to the radical dilation of one's world that comes with the experience of God's love, or you know, um, in response to the vertigo that can create a clamping down and refusal of that dilation. So yeah. So anyway, all of which is to say, yeah, personal transformation is going to be is in fact if you get all the way to talking about functional specialization, it's going to be the kind of hinge at the middle of his model of theological specialization. Um, yeah,
So
yeah.
would you say that?
Oh, sorry. Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry.
Oh, it's all right.
Just one more thing was, would you say that the three conversions would sort of uh, make possible the complete fulfillment of the four levels of reasonableness, intelligence, responsibility, as opposed to a kind of additional, you know, revelatory, transformative insight? Whereas if you don't have the three conversions, you're not actually getting to attentiveness, responsibility, etc. So is it just
Yeah,
maximizing those?
yeah. So if you go look at chapter 4 of Method in Theology, he's going to talk about it. Essentially what he's going to do is he's going to do a kind of phenomenological transposition of Thomas's metaphysics of gratia sanans and gratia elevans, of healing grace and elevating grace. So there is both. Um, there is both a a removal of the limits or the obstacles to what he'll call authenticity, just to say sustained attentiveness, intelligence, reasonableness, and responsibility. But there's also uh, a new, previously unforeseeable horizon in which that happens, such that he'll define faith as knowledge born of religious love. That there's a kind of there's a knowledge that uh, becomes available to you um, on the basis of your receipt of God's love that would not be available to you otherwise. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mike, where are you?
Yeah, I just had a couple, not to take us too far afield, but so we've got like the big three conversions: religious, moral, and intellectual. Every once in a while, I know he will write about affective conversion, and
Yep.
sometimes it seems like it's equated with religious conversion. Sometimes it seems like it's a totally different dealio, but I'm not clear on that. And then there's, Doran's psychic conversion,
Sure.
which we can throw in there. And then I've read over the years, different people were throwing the word conversion around quite a lot. I remember James Marsh wrote a book about political conversion and so on,
Yeah.
where like it goes down the line. I was wondering if like you could just shed some light, make relate these to one another, briefly.
Yeah. So Doran and Lonergan was pretty okay. Lonergan, before he passed, gave this the imprimatur, as it were. Um, so Doran, who at the time was working on Jung and Ricoeur, and then began to work on Lonergan as well, spoke of what he called psychic conversion. Um, and he took the opportunity to do this basically to say, well, our embodiment means that we're conscious in two ways, right? So when it comes to reality, we have these two criteria. We have the criterion of our animal extroversion, which we share with our pets, um, and but we also have this other intellectual criterion that we have by virtue of our rational nature. And now, human authenticity in its sort of full flourishing requires um, subsuming the animal criterion underneath this rational, fully human one. But Bob really hung his hat on the fact that, but you don't stop being conscious in these two ways, in this kind of properly intellectual way, and also in this embodied, sensitive way. And so for Bob, there's a kind of corresponding conversion that needs to happen in terms of it's a kind of if the other three are spiritual conversions, intellectual, moral, and religious, there's a kind of material conversion that needs to happen in which and he uses Jung's psychoanalytic language in which the psychic sensor, which is organizing. Um, and in some cases highlighting, in other cases casting into uh, the periphery the various sensitive images and symbols and the like that make up the conscious flow of our um, awareness in this life. That sensor function can operate neurotically so that it represses things that really need to rise up into consciousness to be understood and made sense of and acted in light of. Um, and so the conversion, right? All these conversions are to are turning away from something which is inauthentic towards something which is authentic. And for Bob Doran, the psychic conversion is a transformation of one's psyche where the sensor function is no longer repressive, but now is constructive, right? The kinds of images and symbols um, are brought up into consciousness in a way that's constructive, that aids spiritual authenticity and doesn't impede it. So that's psychic conversion in Doran. His first book is, I think, called Subject and Psyche, and he gets into all this. And he integrates it in his big heavy duty book, Theology and the Dialectics of History. If you want to go look at that stuff. Um, Lonergan and Doran both distinguish psychic conversion from what he called affective conversion. I think the basic idea of affective conversion was um, especially correlative to moral conversion. Um, I can be morally converted at a kind of spiritual level where I've made this decision that I'm going to live and act, or at least try to live and act by virtue of my apprehension of genuine, authentic values and not just what's satisfactory or pleasurable to me, right? I'm going to stay in the kitchen and I'm going to do the damn dishes instead of having a second cocktail and sitting on the couch, right? Because I'm a member of a family and stuff. As much as I would rather have another Sazerac and just sit next to my dog, like somebody's got to put the stuff in the dishwasher. Um, and relative, but I can have made that decision and still have my whole affective being be totally at odds with it. Um, Aquinas is funny about this. Aquinas says, it can be that God's grace makes it so at most doing the good is just not repugnant to you anymore. Um, which is funny, right? Like, yeah, I'm not like I'm not super stoked to be doing the good, but at least I don't hate it. That would be an instance of what I think Lonergan means when he talks about affective conversion, that your feelings about your moral situation and your moral commitments fall into line with your sort of cold, disinterested judgments of value.
Well, can I
So
ask
go ahead.
all right,
Yeah, yeah.
so it seems like they would be working kind of in tandem, psychic and affective. I mean, they're probably
Yes.
all working in tandem, right? But so affective conversion is the feelings as conscious on the fourth level, so to speak, when I'm deliberating a course of action or what have you, evaluating a situation. Feelings are the carrier there of value.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, feelings are carried by images,
Yes.
right? And so I may be in need of some psychic conversion to really be authentic affectively,
That's right.
right? And then vice versa. I suppose there's like an above downward effect where if I have the affective conversion, maybe the psychic conversion will kind of get nudged.
Right. No, no, no. So that's very good. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, it may be that. So, and so it can be that you're, in the transformation of your affectivity, um, new symbols become salient to you,
Right.
and rehabituate your sort of psychic sensor in that way. Um, I think those are all those two notions of conversion. I'm pretty convinced by. There's a kind of analogy of conversion between them because there's an analogy between the two ways of being conscious. Um, Neil Ormerod published a thing a few years ago about ecological conversion. Marsh has his thing about political conversion. I love those guys. I'm uh those strike me to this is an intra-Lonerganian uh
Inside baseball.
yeah, I was going to say the thing I'm about to say is intra-Lonerganian shade. Those things strike me as more descriptive than theoretical or explanatory. Um, they are. It seems to me that they are describing things which fall under the penumbra of the other conversions. And so, as a theoretical matter, do I think that they're like on super sound footing? Not really. Do I think it's a bad idea for Lonergan scholars to sort of use the sort of um, connotative imagery of conversion to extend out to these different areas in which these things need to unfold, or in the way in which these more basic conversions need to be expressed in the political realm and in terms of integral ecology? No, I think that's fine. And I think it's probably good as a communication strategy, even if in my Lonerganian persnicketyness, I might want to put an asterisk on them. Um,
Thank you.
yeah. We Lonergan people are nothing if not persnickety.
On the, or Francis, were you talking? You're muted. I'll defer to you.
That's kind of you. Sorry about that. Techno
Oh,
Saturday.
great. Okay, here we go.
On the conversion pieces, going back to something you were talking earlier about, like the Aboriginal culture of Australia and what we did here in the States and stuff like that. The question always comes to my mind, can can the people who were making those decisions back up? You were talking about the whole inherent holiness and humility of the saints, right? Or of holy people. Okay, that's one set. But to people who are also philosophizing and theologizing and making the rules, people who DeCasas was talking to about, what they were doing to in the New World and what was going on in Australia. Can the people who are making those bad decisions be converted in the way Lonergan's talking about it, even though they are totally screwing the shit up, but they're doing it in that good, out of a good place in their head, but they're wrong. Does the question make
Yeah, no,
sense
it's
at
good.
all? And how do you call it on it, right? I mean, that's the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
second. How do you call anybody on that?
I mean, let me go in reverse order. The way you
Sure.
call people on it is you try to direct attention to either the data to which they were inattentive, the question they didn't ask, the insight they didn't have, the judgment they didn't make, right? The decision, the value they didn't commit themselves to or realize, right? That's how you call them on it. Is um, you indicate by the existence of the to go back to the object operation language, right? Look, these objects aren't on the scene, um, and the reason they're not on the scene is because the operations that would have brought them onto the scene didn't happen, and those operations have an operator who was responsible for coming up with them. Um, and so, Lonergan can talk about in the dialectic of authority in third collection, the sin of backwardness, right? That really the kind of conditions were there for you to have to figure this out, and you kind of willfully make sure you don't figure it out. Because everybody's making a good dollar, or because it would call into question your sense of your racial superiority, whatever the malign motivation is. um, you didn't do the thing you ought to have done, and that the conditions were right for you to have done. Lonergan, so let me work my way back then. Um, so Lonergan makes the distinction between, I brought it before, major and minor authenticity. Um, and really that's what we're talking about here, is that someone can have been sort of within the parameters of their cultural horizon. They exhibit authenticity, at least in those areas where you would sort of expect them to based on what was available. Um, and then there are people who are intellectual and moral and religious geniuses who are edge cases, and who even though it was not likely with the available materials that they would come up with those insights or those values or those commitments, um, do it anyway. And in fact, some of them are like super geniuses, and they do it all the time, right? Isaac Newton got sent home from school because the plague came to town, and he went in his attic and he like invented modern physics in a few days. Um, right? That's a kind of major intellectual authenticity that explodes open a whole bunch of new possibilities. Um, now, uh, there is I didn't want to lose the thread of the sort of place where you started on that though, which is, oh, right. And it might be good. Maybe I should have had it in the curriculum for this. So in that respect, maybe I dropped the ball. But that essay, Dialectic of Authority, Lonergan says, well, look, the analysis, when you're talking about kind of collective responsibility, and the function of leaders within a group, which is sort of uh, together operating, right? So the leader directs the group, but the group empowers the leader by cooperating with them. Uh, Analyzing relative authenticity, the dialectic of authority, of authentic power, which is what authority is the legitimate, authentic exercise of power for Lonergan. He says it's enormously complicated as an analytic matter. You write doctoral dissertations about it. But he says there's also a kind of a shorthand. And the shorthand is progress or decline. The fruit of inauthenticity is decline. The situation gets worse. And the fruit of authenticity is progress. Um, and so, are things getting better or worse? And if they're getting worse, then people are being inauthentic. And if they're getting better, people are probably being authentic, at least to some degree. The fly in the ointment is that your judgment of whether things are getting better or worse is relative to your own
Where you're sitting.
intellectual, moral, and religious attainment.
Well, also
And
if
your own.
you're the Aboriginal culture or the Native American culture, you know, what looks like an advance of civilization from one side is the destruction of the other.
Yeah.
I mean, setting aside things like smallpox blankets and things like that. I mean, just sort of
And the wheat and the tares grow up together. And
yeah.
so, I was reading the galleys for this book by my teacher Joseph Obadiah about African biblical hermeneutics, which is coming out with Fortress Press eventually here. Um, and he makes the point that like, look, one of the things that came with colonization was systematic literacy. Um, and so now African Christians, just ordinary African Christians, can read their Bibles. Um, and so like, for all the other horrors and the impoverishment and colonization and and dispossession and stuff, um, nevertheless, these colonizers came and set up schools and taught everybody to read. At least in the part of Nigeria he's from, and that's a good thing. That empowered them. It made things better in that maybe narrow regard, but significant regard. And so there is a certain element of there's going to be a kind of subtle dialectical sifting that always has to go on when you're making those judgments about things getting better and getting worse. You have to say, well, in what regard, right? With regard to what? Um, but yeah. So anyway, and that and part of Lonergan's point here though is like though on the one hand there's no way to flip to the back of the book for the answers like in a textbook. Nevertheless, there is in you the notion of being and the notion of value, which drives the process of transcendental method. And so, how would you improve your apprehension of whether things are going well or going poorly? Well, you'd be attentive. You'd try to come up with questions about what you observed. You try to answer the questions. You try to check your answers against the data, and then you try to act in light of your understanding of reality and your apprehension of value and your feelings. Right? And no, that doesn't skip you to the end to pristine objectivity. But right, if you want to do better instead of worse, that's what's available to you as your means of doing that.
And I think conversion, like for somebody, the little I know about DeCassis or anything like that, about what he was trying to do in the New World, is like at some level, conversion allows you to see through all the other principles and policies and teachings and premises and say something here feels really screwed up, right? I mean, this is just cruel, or this is hateful, or it can't possibly be okay to give smallpox blankets. Not that whatever who did that, but I
Yeah,
mean,
no, but no, that's right. I mean, it is, and it's the willingness to tolerate. Um, there's a real social interpersonal power to having well articulated rationalizations because of the certitude with which you can speak. The not genuine certitude, but the kind of air of certitude with which you can speak. And someone who is trying to move a culture forward on a moral matter or an intellectual matter, but let's stick with moral. Um, they they may know that the rationalizations are not expressions of genuine knowledge, which is to say they're bullshit. And they know that there's some better way of understanding the moral circumstance and the moral demands. But they might not know that better way yet. And even if they have had some insight into it, they might not be able to articulate it very well. And so they're going to show up to the discourse, with I mean, metaphorically, a kind of stammer. Um, and so in the interpersonal dynamics, they can seem wishy-washy, loosey-goosey, uncertain, because they know they don't know. And the person who's set on an immoral path but has really nice, crisp rationalizations, they can be very rhetorically affecting. Um, so yeah, it's uh, uh, we never get out of the fact that we need God to save us. Um, it's once that thing starts to spiral down, we need help, or the spiral tightens.
I have kind of a two-part question still on conversion,
Great.
mostly about psychic conversion. So, first part is to make sure I'm understanding right. Um, Hearing you describe Doran's idea, like, so it's the shift from repressive to constructive, and my mind went to like, does this involve questions about like family of origin or long-term memories where I've been shaped by a certain understanding that um, I've suppressed, but the conversion is to integrate this kind of in a more constructive direction. So is that kind of how psychic conversion manifests? And then the second part is you described a general um, progression from religious to moral to intellectual. Does psychic fit in a progressive in that progression in some way, or is it alongside all three, or what is the relation between it and the other three?
Um, I'm not sure I know the answer to your second question. That's an interesting one. Um, except that probably the priority of religious conversion remains, um, because it has to do with right. There's a kind of deep unwillingness in our psyche the psychic sensor that's operating repressively, right? It's I can't tolerate the 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 meanings and the affects that are carried in particular images. Um, whether what I can't tolerate is intimacy or whether what I can't tolerate it, whatever. Um, and so that transformation of willingness can sort of reach all the way down to that deep um, subconscious level. Um, but that's a guess. I'm not really sure how Doran articulates. I'm sure he does. I just am not remembering. Uh, to your first question, yeah, I mean it's psychology stuff, right? In the sort of a retail sense of psychology, in the clinical sense of psychology. Um, you know, uh, I know somebody who was just horrifically abused as a kid in a medical setting, and so getting medical care of any kind for them is really fraught because everything in that space is a kind of totem or icon of their awful, I mean, unthinkable trauma. Um, and so, in that case, right, there's a a real repressive functioning operating in the avoidance of things which have that symbolic quality. And it's rooted in this terrible, really unspeakable childhood experience. Um, but there are more mundane versions of that in terms of family cultures and family system stuff. There's a guy I had dinner with on Saturday night last week named Paul LaChance, who is a Lonergan in the Lonergan scholarly community, but who does not work in academia. He's a like a marriage and family counselor, um, and this is the world he works in all the time. Is he, using family systems theory and also Lonergan and Doran to help people navigate these pieces and integrate, become whole selves and not sort of these a bag of fragmented psychological parts.
Thanks.
Yeah, Mike.
I have another question, just apropos of being in this book. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm listening. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, it's telling me my connection is unstable.
Oh no, you seem fine on this end.
Great, fantastic. I've read this book a couple of times. I don't think I understand it. I mean, I understand little parts of it. Every time I read it, I feel like, yeah, I got this chapter. Okay. It took me a while. But when I sit back and I look at the book and what he's getting at, I don't really know what it's supposed to look like. You know what I mean? Like to be to do theology methodically. As opposed to however it's been done before. Yeah. I'm not sure what it means beyond like adding sort of qualifying prefaces to whatever my scholarship is, maybe a sidelong bow to somebody working in a different subspecialty or functional specialty. I'm not sure what it's about. I know we're kind of jumping like ahead to whatever course you might offer on the book, but could you speak to it just a bit?
Yeah, I mean, so Mike's making reference to what the sort of back half of the book is about is something Lonergan called functional specialization, which was an idea he had in 1965 and that turned into this book. And the idea is instead of having specializations based on field, so right now, if you get a PhD in theology, there's you have ethicists and you have historical theologians and you have systematicians and scripture scholars. And you've got all these sub specializations underneath that based on area, where the object of inquiry is the thing that sets the parameters of your area of specialization. And the idea of functional specialization is that the operation, not the object, is the thing that sets the parameters of your specialization. And so, and the basic idea is that there's 8 of them, and that they map onto the levels of consciousness in a kind of up the scale, down the scale way. So you have basic research, which has to do with, you might think of it in terms of, getting critical editions of manuscripts and things available to scholars, translation work, that kind of thing. Interpretation, which is just trying to figure out what the authors of these texts meant by the text they generated, and or what the text meant to the audience it was addressed to, right? And then history, where you try to sort of determine what was going on based on these artifacts of human meaning, what was sort of going forward, and then inevitably you get differences of historical opinion between both between interpreters and historians, and so dialectic has to do with is the fourth functional specialty, and it has to do with trying to discern to articulate the ground of the differences. So what do I mean by that? Right. If a historian thinks that bodily resurrection is per se impossible, then they're probably not going to write a history in which they countenance the idea that um, Jesus Christ rose from the grave and encountered the disciples after his resurrection and then commissioned them to become apostles. That's just not going to be, if they consider it a kind of metaphysical impossibility, um, then it's not really an option for them to tell it to tell a history in which that's an event that occurs. Um, and so the operative notion of what is real and what can be real is really important um, in terms of what will be countenanced by historians, and so is often the root of disagreements between historians. Now that's a very blunt example, but there's all kinds of more subtle examples, right? About which kinds of things are really kind of operative forces in history, and so you'll have differences between um, uh, you know Marxian historians and Frankfurt School historians um, and on, right? You can imagine all the differences. And then Lonergan sort of you get to the top of the levels and you pivot back over and you have foundations which try to articulate some of what we've been talking about here, the sort of ground of how you adjudicate between different historical and interpretive accounts on the basis of a sound cognitional theory, epistemology, and metaphysics. Um, and then from there, you're able to hopefully articulate at the next level down doctrines, which are judgments essentially about um, what's going on in salvation history. Systematics, which tries to understand the internal unity of what's affirmed at the level of doctrines about salvation history, and then communications, which endeavors to take uh, the judgments articulated in doctrines and the theoretical systematicity articulated at the level of systematics, um, and take that scaffolding and carry it out into the various cultures of the world to help improve the quality of the Christian culture, the Christianized culture in the various places where there are Christians trying to live the Christian life. And so that's Lonergan's model for how, and really it looks like I mean the way I model is a kind of pyramid up and down, but really it's cyclical because the second phase generates all kinds of material that then itself can become the object of the first phase of the research phase. Um, and so Lonergan envisions this as a kind of, he says, the circle of inquiry also rolls. It's also a wheel, or the wheel of inquiry. Yes, he says, doesn't just turn, it also rolls. Um, and so that's how it rolls, is it generates material that then becomes the object of investigation. Um, I mean, just at the level of the practical problem of herding academic cats enough to make that kind of collaboration and cooperation happen makes me tired to think about. So many emails. Um, but yeah, I mean, there is a real question about like how feasible is this? What does this really concretely look like? That being said, um, at Seton Hall we have this really wonderful program called the Praxis program, and it's the capstone faculty development course for a kind of mission integration wing of the university. And it's Monsignor Dick Liddy constructed it to be all built around folks learning a little Lonergan. And we were kind of doing the levels of consciousness transcendental method thing a few weeks ago in this class. And somebody asked a question about like, well, yeah, but like what if you at the level of judgment you just get like really basic disagreements? Like everybody's been attentive and intelligent and reasonable, but you just like come to just opposed judgments. And I said a little bit about sort of, well, sometimes people come to different judgments because they are complementary. Sometimes the judgments differ because they're part of a kind of genetic series of judgments. And so one is from kind of an earlier phase and one is from a later phase. But you can also just have dialectically opposed judgments where like one or both of us are wrong. Um, but I said, the part of the value of Lonergan's cognitional theory is that because it's differentiated out into these levels, when you have disagreement, it gives you the opportunity to specify where the disagreement might be originating, right? Is there some data that's been overlooked? Is there some question that's either poorly asked or hasn't been asked? Is there some insight that hasn't happened yet, right? Is there some evidence that's being overlooked? Are we not being sufficiently critical in reflecting, right? Are we assuming something's true, but we don't really know? Um, it lets you it lets you take the bluntness of two people butting heads in disagreement, and it gives you a kind of taxonomy for thinking about how the disagreement originated and also the procedure for maybe ameliorating the disagreement through shared inquiry. Now that example happens at the level of, a couple of people, but I think um, one of the things that Lonergan's method offers, even if we can't put on its feet some kind of um, you know theological school of functionally specialized theological research. Now, if anybody wants to donate a few $100 million so that I can do that, send me an email. But short of that, I do think one thing it can offer is that it gives you this uh, again this sort of way of specifying all the different places at which disagreement can happen, and let you triage or diagnose where things might, if things have gone wrong, where they might be going wrong. It can also help you think about if you want to contribute to progress in theology, where are the articulation points where you might intervene to make a contribution, right? If you're sufficiently perverse that you want to become a theological scholar, um, figuring out how to do that in a way that isn't just self-indulgence, but that helps move the ball forward. It gives you some sense of, okay, where could I insert myself in a way that's going to both draw on the work of others, but also extend them forward, and even more than extending them forward to my own work, provide resources for other people to pick up the ball and carry it down the field when I'm done. Um, and I think that's really to me, that's the core vision or value, is for theologians to think about themselves as somewhere on this wheel of inquiry as it rolls along. And what are ways with scholarly integrity and responsibility can I take hold of what's been received, do something with it, contribute something, and then to whom am I handing it on, and to what end? Um, all right. Otherwise, it's like I'm just publishing, articles and monographs that get the highest research score according to my tenure and promotion committee's rubric, right? And then forgive me, Paul, then you've climbed inside your own asshole, and like, who cares? Um, you know, uh, then it's just, stuff for libraries to waste money on. Um, Andrew, yes.
I think, Mike, were you going to follow up?
I was, but go ahead, Drew.
All right, thanks. So I mean, I think you kind of put the point that there's something about, I love this and I think it's really helpful, but that there's something that's, and maybe this, I don't want to besmirch Nate, but this may be related to what Nate was sort of getting at earlier about
Uh-huh.
object. The thing about method, it seems like this is not really how theology happens in fact, right? So that and so that it seemed there's something inadequate about that, right? And I think it's related to this concern perhaps about object, right? I mean, it seems like Christian theology happens primarily with these sort of eruptions or achievements of genius that then gets worked out by others around them, right? So you think about Origen, right, or Thomas and Thomism, right, or Francis and Franciscans, or whatever, or more recently like
Lonergan and
oh,
Lonerganians.
right, that or Elder Silduan and Sophrony, right, and then the monastery at Essex, right, and that they're working these experiences out right? But that the reception of these experiences doesn't seem quite the same as what, or it doesn't seem susceptible. There's something different about that, I think, than the method that Lonergan's laying out, which again is really helpful. But there's this seems like this inevitable decline into from say Thomas into Thomism, right? Where Fred Lawrence, calls him becomes the canned goods of intellectuals, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that yeah, I don't there's something that this seems to not, although he talks about it, obviously, right, with the Holy Spirit flooding into our hearts and thing, he sort of talks about it, but yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm trailing
So
off.
good. No, it's a good question.
It was a question. All right, excellent. No, I'm just teasing. Yes.
Or problem or something.
Yeah. Or
Uh,
speech.
there's a few things to be said about that. Yeah, and it's well taken. I mean, one thing to be said about it is that the modern ideal of science um, makes um, the model of the capacious genius and their school obsolete. Um, just the ideal of Wissenschaft isn't uh, whose compendious system will we order ourselves beneath. I think there was a little bit of that impulse. Forgive me if I've said this before, but after the Second Vatican Council, I think in Catholic circles there was a little sense of, okay, we're liberated from having to be um, subordinate all theology to the genius of Thomas Aquinas. Who's going to be the new genius? And so people sorted themselves under Rahner, de Lubac, Ratzinger, Lonergan, Balthazar, whoever, right? Um, and so then you end up with Rahnerians, Balthazarians, Lonerganians, um, Ratzingerites. I don't know. Um, and Lonergan is really, I think, shouting into the wind in some ways, trying to say, if we do that, we're missing the whole opportunity of engaging modern culture. Um, that modern culture isn't just like blue jeans and television. Modern culture is also this new way of doing science. And yeah, it began and established itself in terms of a new way of doing natural science. But in the 19th century, with philology really first, and then the development of scientific history, and the inroads it made into scripture scholarship, uh, the ideal of Geisteswissenschaften, of human science, has changed too. And so too then will the model of theological science change uh, or not? And his bet was that the model of theological science does need to change, and it needs to change by taking its cues from some of the real achievements he thought happened both in natural and in human sciences. The big difference between natural science and human science for Lonergan is that in the human sciences, the objects of inquiry um, are constituted by human meanings, not just mediated by human meanings. And so they're correlative to the human spirit, and the human spirit is historical. So it turns out that doing human science is like way more complicated and way harder than doing natural science. Um, because of the plasticity of the object you're investigating. Um, Now, theological science, if we ever come up with such a thing, and that's what Lonergan was trying to do, is even tougher because in theological science, you're trying to discern in the expressions and constructions of human meaning uh, God's intervention of God's meanings in history. Um, right. So, and I don't mean by that anything really that strange to the Christian, insofar as Jesus spoke Aramaic, and used and crafted his parables out of the rural agricultural culture of Judea, first century Palestine. And so to get the point of what Jesus is saying about God, one has to know a little something about the culture in which he articulated that. Um, and what insights one has about that, one has to then carry forward in the Christian community. Um, which is why, they built cathedral, schools and then universities for preachers in medieval Europe. Because having, some barely literate schmuck just wander out there and say whatever, you're going to get all, um, that's how you get Waldensians. Do you want Waldensians? Um, and so, um, so yeah, so there is a respect in which it is always theology is. Oh, and sorry, and the last piece of the point I was going to make there is that, and the discernment of genuine divine meanings within expressions and constructions of human meaning is available only to the eyes of faith. Um, and so all the challenges of the Geisteswissenschaften as a kind of scholarly scientific enterprise all apply to theology, and you have to maintain uh what one has to be, in Paul's language, the spiritual man. Um, right. So on the one hand, there's an opportunity, Lonergan said in Absence of God in Modern Culture, it seems like one should be able to learn a bunch of lessons from these other advances in the modern ideal of science, but also, uh, continuing to maintain the infrastructural imaginary of the way theology has been done, let's say let's go with the 10th century to now. There's needed a real, um, there's needed, frankly, a revolution um, in how theology is done, um, because the scope of the task has been dilated in a way that the old procedure just isn't, it's not adequate to it. Um, and I mean, if you really want to get into it, if you really want to get into it, if um, if you follow Lonergan in seeing that in addition to the visible mission of the Word in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, um, and the visible mission of the Spirit in the life of the churches. Um, there is also the invisible mission of the Spirit, in which the love of God is poured into hearts, kind of irrespective of where anyone is culturally, historically, socially, whatever. Um, that means that divine meaning is available and present potentially in the in the expressions and constructions of human meaning in every culture and every place in every corner of human history. And so if you're going to give some kind of scholarly account of that, the fire hose of data relevant to that inquiry is just nothing compared to like what Abelard was trying to deal with, um, or Lombard's sentences, right? Lombard's trying to get control of one culture's religious tradition of expressions. Um, this is just the quantity involved has a quality all its own, as I think Napoleon said. Um, yeah. So anyway, I don't. Now I suddenly feel like I came down on you hard on that. I didn't mean to come down on you, but
No,
I do think part of the point I wanted to get across in this course is that the transition Lonergan's asking us to take cognizance of is a really profound one. And the more you think about it, the more sort of vertiginous it becomes.
One of the things that strikes me is that it would have to be a far more collaborative mode than we have used in the past.
Yep.
Like, and theology hasn't really been any different than every other academic discipline in that regard, right? It's still like competition is really what drives the, I mean, our culture especially, like a lot. And it's pretty clear to me that what he's asking us to do, there's like, I don't think he doesn't say it directly, but it certainly implies, it strongly implies a level of collaboration that does not exist in what's come before.
Yep. And the institutions aren't built to facilitate it yet.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't joking about, if anybody wants to donate a few $100 million. Because you do need, you just, there's certain material conditions. I mean, on one level, it's never been more possible thanks to digital technology. But on another level, uh, you know, like I said, a lot of emails. It's gonna, there's a whole new habituation that would have to be generated, and human lives and careers, especially, are short enough that you have to get the habituation online, and then you have to pass it on to your graduate students, and then you have to get them jobs. Good luck. Um, Sufficient that they can themselves form. I mean, right? Um, there's a real significant civilizational challenge here. Now,
Yeah.
on the
Yeah,
other hand,
that was something that, yeah, it's something that I'm very attuned to because I lead a I'm on the national leadership council, and I run a local group for this movement that's called Estuary. And the entire concept behind Estuary is to bring together people who don't agree, and to bring what people who are religious and people who are not religious, people who have completely different politics, completely different backgrounds, to bring them together and to talk about serious things in a respectful way.
yeah,
And to really to try to, in a way that builds toward developing a common spirit and a synthesis.
yeah.
And so I'm very involved in that. And so that was something that I was sensitive to because I'm already oriented in that way. So
Mhm.
that's why I'm always bringing like different people together and trying to get them to talk.
No, it's great. Yeah, well,
So
and I think maybe what I was saying before might, I hope that Lonergan's cognitional theory might be of some help in that work, right? To be able to, when you reach some kind of aporia, his differentiation of the operations involved.
one thing I've noticed in what I do is that it goes a long way. It's like it's not, the objective isn't actually to get everyone to agree, but but if I can come to understand why you think what you do,
Yeah,
right? And I'm able to like relate to your perspective enough to say like, oh, okay, if I had all of these priors that this person has
yeah.
and was thinking about these things in the same way, I can see how they get where you don't necessarily start agreeing with them, but it completely changes the conversation, like especially going forward and over time it allows a different conversation to happen where it's like it's not just like immediately like whatever the issue where there is this deep aporia when it comes to it, it doesn't just shut down the conversation because you've now at least gone at least far enough to understand why the person thinks that, even if you don't agree with them.
And if you've ever seen me uh argue with people on Twitter or social media or whatever, I don't do it as much anymore. Come to my senses. But I, if when I would get into controversies with people in that space, I I'm always I'm not being facetious. I always try to celebrate when we get clarity about the ground of the point of disagreement. That's an achievement. I mean, to be able to figure out what's the real basis of disagreement here, um, is a huge deal.
Yeah, and it's often several layers deeper than you assume it is at the outset.
Oh yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. For sure, for sure. Well, so normally we'd wrap up right around now, but I'm willing to hang in for I think my son had a sleepover at a friend's house last night. I think it's up till about 4 in the morning, so he may be asleep on the couch presently. And the girls are out with their mom, so I have a little extra time. So I don't want to shut down questions if people have any anything still hanging around. Yeah, Connor, go ahead.
Yeah, so there was a question from a few weeks ago that I was reminded of again that we kind of touched on of the relationship of philosophy to theology. So in this one, he had said, in the 12th place, the introduction of transcendental method abrogates the old metaphor that describes philosophy as a handmaid of theology and replaces it by a very precise fact. And then he kind of goes on to talk about the sort of universal or transcendental phenomenology of method as supporting theology, but cross-disciplinary. And then in a previous week, I think two weeks ago, he had said, indeed, once philosophy becomes existential and historical, once it asks about man, not in the abstract, not as he would be in some sort of state of pure nature, but as he is in fact here and now, and all the concreteness of his living and dying, the very possibility of the old distinction between philosophy and theology vanishes. So my first thought was, asking whether was theology not always also concerned with both absolute and universal truths without disregarding the particular, but rather fusing them, hence the incarnation, the kind of Jewish Christian concern with history.
Yeah.
Is I think someone like Milbank would agree with Lonergan here in that modernity brought about, in some sense, this artificial separation of those two disciplines that were much more previously interpenetrating fields. So I'm wondering if Lonergan would, about that old false distinction, would he think it only came about, or at least was exacerbated by at least some of the scholasticism, or as part of classicism, like the classical paradigm?
Yeah, I don't. A small correction, I would say. I wouldn't think that Lonergan would want to call it a false distinction. It was a distinction that was operative within a particular um, ideal of science, a logical one. Um, and and on that logical scheme, right? It's possible to have um, it's possible to have the distinction between philosophy and theology happen at the level of Milbank has that language of sort of spheres and areas, right? The natural and the supernatural is different spheres and areas. Um, and as long as one of the things that happens between the medieval and the modern is that this is going to sound really weird. Uh, Medieval hierarchy, especially as one sees it in those who are relying on Pseudo-Dionysius. This is a weird way of saying this, so bear with me. Um, Medieval hierarchy is flat. It's about the coincident operations of cooperating principles. Um, and so God acts in my acting is, the divine concursus, right? Um, and there isn't a separate sphere of divine action over against an area of human action. But the very principle that makes ontologically existent my acting um, is God's action, right? So it's a hierarchy, right? God is still that on which my action depends, but it's flat in that sense because they're coincident. Uh, in modernity, you get one of the things you start to get is you start to get sort of billiards table physics, where operation and causation are understood in terms of sort of bodies banging into each other. And that imaginary of causation really transforms the philosophical uh, ideas as well. And so you end up with this idea of the distinction between philosophy and theology becomes not about um, a flat hierarchy of coincident but distinguishable principles that are investigated along two different orders, um, where the distinction is real, but it's not separable. In modernity, you start to get the idea that these things are separable, right? This is kind of Milbank's point, I take it to be. And and so then you can start to get the sort of the secular conceived the way he analyzes in TST and things like that. Anyway, this is all kind of throat clearing. Forgive me. But but all of that is a way of saying, I don't think Lonergan would call the distinction false within the horizon in which it was operative, at least in Thomas. What happens and here I follow Blondel pretty closely. I think one of the powerful things about Blondel's criticism of modern philosophy is his criticism isn't that it's too modern, it's that it's not modern enough. That for Blondel, uh, modern philosophy has a methodological principle of immanence, but too often it also has a kind of it has a kind of doctrine of immanence. Um, that rather than saying we are going to begin from and investigate what is given phenomenally, um, and that's going to be our kind of methodological starting point. And so we're not going to sort of privilege any doctrines, whether they be theological or philosophical, um, except insofar as we can sort of arrive to them through an analysis of the phenomenal. Um, a lot of modern philosophy said, and so the only things which can be real and admissible philosophically are immanent, are phenomenal things. And his criticism is, how is that not an extrinsically imposed doctrine that's not justified by the phenomena? And so when you read L'Action, he shows at all these different levels of phenomena the way in which you can never close them off um, against the transcendent, right? That the phenomenality of each of these immanent spheres is always open to some transcendent term, even though the transcendent term isn't given in the phenomenal. Um, and so Blondel is doing philosophy. He's doing it in a way where he very self-consciously tries not to transgress into the realm of the revealed, um, and so into a properly theological kind of zone. This is something Milbank criticizes him for what it's worth. Um, but nevertheless, right, heuristically, the transcendent is a term you can never get rid of in Blondel's philosophy. Um, Even though there's a kind of methodological setting of boundaries in terms of what can be admitted. I think Lonergan would talk about philosophy. I hope that wasn't too opaque. Lonergan, I think, would talk about philosophy and theology in similar terms to Blondel. That uh, you are going to um, you're going to distinguish it based on a kind of question of proportion. Um, and so the where do you pivot, really where do you pivot between philosophy and theology for Lonergan? Um, is it happens between the restricted and the unrestricted. It happens in terms of proportion, not in terms of areas or spheres, or top or topoi or something. Um, and so you can treat of the same set of data philosophically and theologically, um, because you're considering the concrete, not abstractly delineated areas or topoi. Um, yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I recall from a couple of weeks ago, Lonergan writing, that philosophy can like get you to God, but it will take a theologian to answer questions about how or whether God is dynamic.
Hmm. Yeah, that's right.
So would those be two different topics, or is it just, you know what I mean?
It would be the same. I mean, so there, what you have is uh, you have a consideration of the same data, but it's different questions. Um, and so, uh, the philosopher is going to ask. I mean, really, this is just Thomas's five ways, but the philosopher can ask, uh, is the explicability of the world itself explicable? That's a question about God. Um, and one can generate a heuristic that says, um, well, if the explicability of the world is really intelligible, then it has a sufficient reason for being, and and it would have to be an unrestricted sufficient reason, because if it wasn't unrestricted, there might be something in the world that's left out of it. And so, yeah, there's a kind of infinite explanation for the explicability of reality. And by this, everyone means this is what everyone means by the word God, right? Um, but that doesn't. But there's nothing in there that would need. That could just be Aristotle's God, right? Thought, thinking, thought. The idea that there would be any kind of process in God, qua God, right? Um, it's not even a question that would really come up, because you just don't need it to be to explain explicability, for example. Um, so why does that question come up? Well, the question comes up the because Christian preachers keep saying that the Son is begotten of the Father, right? And so you have the Christian, the context of Christian religious practice is the thing that generates the theological question. Is you know we keep going to mass and talking about the Father sending his Son. Well, if the Father is God and God is um, what classical theists, what monotheists mean by God, how can God send anything? Well, now you've got a set of theological questions about about internal dynamism in God. Um, but where do they emerge? They don't emerge from a general consideration of the relationship between the human mind and reality. They emerge from the context of Christian preaching and prayer and liturgy. Um,
Thank you.
yeah. If
Does
Oh, sorry, just really quick. Sorry, well, really quick.
Sure.
If you're interested in this question about philosophy and theology, um, there's a whole series of lectures called Philosophy of God and Theology that where Lonergan gets into the nitty-gritty details of this. So if you're animated by this question in Lonergan, there is a place to go. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Just a broader question of, does method give us any tools for having conversations outside of the group of people who already believe? You would think that the scientific method or applying method would allow for some ability to expand a conversation outside of that audience, but I'm not sure how it does that.
So, I mean, I think there's a bunch of ways. I mean, one thing is that in principle, Lonergan's method could be used for any religious tradition.
Sure.
Um, and in fact, part of the reason that one of the complaints, I think Ronner's complaint about method and theology was like he doesn't ever say Jesus in this. Um, and how are you going to have a method in theology that doesn't thematize the significance of the incarnate word? But part of Lonergan's point actually is that and part of the reason in chapter 4 his account of religion is so uh, abstract, so heuristic, is like anywhere among humans where this dynamic is operative, where the human willingness uh, to do the good and to know the true is dilated in an unrestricted way. Um, God's love is at work in any community um, that I freeze.
You did, but your voice was coming
Okay,
over.
well that'll work. Any community uh, that articulates its experience of that and um, symbolizes it and ritualizes it and all those things. These are religions, um, and so you could try to improve the credibility. This is my language, not his, but the way I would articulate it is, you know, the community can develop a cultural superstructure that tries to improve the credibility of its beliefs and its evaluations through the scholarly enterprise in this way. And then you could have, I mean, and then comparative religions is kind of right there. Because you can have you can have a dialogue between theologies. Um, and there's, good people doing that kind of thing. Catherine Cornell at BC and stuff. I also think, Lonergan, one of the things I really like about Method is he doesn't, unlike Insight, where he offers a kind of proof for the existence of God and a kind of, and then a heuristic for salvation history in chapters 19 and 20. Here, instead, what he offers are the questions of God. And this is in, I think it's in chapter 4, the very beginning of chapter 4, if you want to look at it. The questions of God are like, is the universe intelligible? Um, you know, is there truth? Are humans the only instance of is human psychology the only source of morality, or is there a moral reality beyond the human? Um, he thinks all of these are questions of God. And whatever answers different communities come to, the questions arise spontaneously. Um, and so even communities in which they come to negative answers, he still thinks even these are theological, insofar as they are offering, whether tacitly or explicitly, answers to the questions of God. Um, and so that can be a way of reading both, I keep focusing on texts, but in fact, in principle, you could apply Lonergan's method to any artifact constructed by, collective human meaning. You could do with art and architecture and music too. But the but the point is that you could investigate the artifacts of any culture in light of the questions of God and do a theology of that culture. Even cultures where the answers are negative, right? So even like if you wanted to do Soviet culture or something, right? Yeah, there's an explicitly negative answer to the question of God. Interestingly, though, maybe not, right? But yeah. So yeah, no, I think I don't think it has to be a kind of intra-Christian closure. I think in principle it should be open to anybody who answers the questions of God, any community that has answers to the questions of God.
Yeah, I was thinking more the the outside to atheists or to agnostics or whatever. I mean, and there's a tool there somehow. I'm not sure how it interplays, but yeah.
I mean, if nothing else, it can help in dialectic and foundations. It can help articulate more clearly what the real disagreements are. I mean, usually, all too often the disagreements are vibes based. Um, I mean, one of the wild things about so much American atheism is that it's intimately correlated with American Christian fundamentalism. Right. So I have so many students or people I just meet in the world who are really militantly atheistic, and who have nothing but venom for religion. But by religion they mean like the dominionist church they grew up in rural Texas, um, and really don't have any notion of the enormous variety of what religion has looked like in human history and across human cultures. Um, and so, to some extent, it's like, yeah, you're an atheist, but like mostly just vis-a-vis the super dysfunctional religious culture you grew up in. Um,
Probably
he,
our dysfunctional religious culture. As far as it look.
he said judgmentally. Yeah.
I did whatever. I mean, earlier, just one other comment. You were talking about developing the culture within the theological community to be able to divvy up the tools and apply method.
Yeah.
It seems to me one of the big obstacles is at the leadership level, their ability to live with the amount of flux that's inherent in the process, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's cool that Schoenberg and Lonergan can have a dispute or a spat or something like that, but we historically have not been good about letting those conversations go on for a while, it seems to me, and that's a problem. That was a soapbox. I can
No, no,
stop
no.
now.
At Seton Hall, we have the diocesan seminary on our campus. And at Seton Hall, the diocesan seminary has its own theology and philosophy faculty that is non-overlapping in any institutional way with the religious studies department, the Catholic studies department, or the philosophy department in the College of Arts and Sciences. Um, the seminary has its entirely its own standalone faculty. Um, so that the priests receive a different education on these topics than the undergraduate students at the university. Um, and that's not by accident. He
Fair
said
point.
carefully.
No, that's a fair point. I mean, somebody made the call to put them in that environment and expose them to that, right? So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's a certain level of self-selection in Catholic vocations at the moment, and it's a whole can of worms, you know. It is a whole can of worms. All right. Let's say I've got about maybe 10 more minutes at most. Um, Anybody got any last things? Yeah, Connor, go ahead.
So he said on page 25, the objects of theology do not lie outside the transcendental field, for that field is unrestricted, and so outside it, there is nothing at all. Um, I don't know if my articulating of the question is very intelligible or correct, but I'm wondering if some might accuse this either of like ontotheology or rationalism, and like the essence of God supposed to be unknowable, at least in this life, even with divine simplicity and Aquinas, for example. So I'm not sure what.
So yeah, yeah. So you touch on an important distinction. Um, for Lonergan, and this is true of Lonergan as early as the 1940s. Um, and he's similar to Ronner in this regard. He and Ronner are on the same page here. Um, the human desire to know um, is unrestricted. The human capacity to know. Let me put it differently. Human questions, there's no limit to what we can ask about. The we can ask everything about everything in principle. Um, our capacity to get answers, correct answers, and to know they're correct to our questions is restricted. And it's restricted because of this, because our knowledge relies on data, both to occasion questions, um, but also to advert to evidence, right? And I can't come to a rational judgment in the absence of evidence. Um, and so for Lonergan, the intention of the desire is unrestricted, but the concrete capacity for the fulfillment of that intention in the form of answers and judgments is restricted. And so I can ask the questions of God, and I can generate a heuristic for the answer based on its my really dependence of my dependence on God ontologically. But I can't know the essence of God unless it's revealed to me in some way. And so that's why gratia sanans and gratia elevans are both operative in his account of religion. That the knowledge born of religious faith, faith, the knowledge born of religious love, um, is a knowledge I couldn't get on my own otherwise, because there's no data on God, um, precisely because of all the classical attributes of God. So the intentional field is unrestricted, but it's unrestricted with regard to my desire, um, it's unrestricted as a notion, but it's plenty restricted with regard to my actual concrete ability to get answers. Because like I'm spatiotemporally located, you know, I'm gonna die, etc. Does that help? That distinction help make sense there? I think he talks about that in that
Yeah,
passage.
he did bring up the unrestricted desire or capacity to ask questions in distinction from our capacity to know. So that's helpful. The only other thing I was curious is, did he ever talk about like the trivium of grammar, logic, and dialectic or rhetoric in relation
Oh,
to his functional specialties?
no.
Okay.
Yeah, no, not really. Um, Lonergan, I think, and he's not alone in this for some of these guys. The the valorization of the structure of classical education that has happened over the past few decades, and attempts to retrieve and reinstantiate it. Um, Lonergan doesn't evince any nostalgia for that. Partly because I think of he was educated in a world that was itself kind of uh, cosplaying that kind of late medieval scholastic ideal and not doing a very good job of it. Um, and those guys, those 20th century uh, religious guys who ended up being vindicated at Vatican II. Most of them generated their scholarship out of their dissatisfaction with their education. So, which is not to denigrate the kind of retrievals of classical education per se, but just to say that I think for biographical reasons, a lot of those guys um, weren't super thrilled about the impulse to look back to that as a model, because they lived in a context where people did look back to it as a model, and but then didn't do it very good. Um, I
I'm,
think that the story about Balthazar is that he
I'm a
put
Thomas Aquinas College alumnus here.
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah. I mean, the story about Balthazar is that he would get like cotton swabs and put wax on them and he'd stick them in his ears and he'd read like Goethe in the back of class. He was so contemptuous of the scholastic training at the time.
Goethe is in the curriculum at TAC, I'll have you
Oh,
know.
I'm sure. Again, I mean, this is one of the things about Anne Carpenter's book about tradition is great on this, right? Um, is that for Peggy, from whom the verbiage of ressourcement comes, um, ressourcement is always correlated for him to revolution, and where revolution for him means the opportunity to begin again after you've kind of gone down the wrong path. And what ressourcement does is give you the materials with which to do something concrete in your beginning again. And so, just because the post Vatican I efforts at retrieval of a medieval ideal was broadly a failure doesn't mean someone couldn't try again in new circumstances and have success. Um, I do worry a little bit about when I lived in Texas, there were some classical education places that seemed mostly places where parents could send their kids without having to vaccinate them and could send them to school with bottles of raw milk, um, about which I have certain epidemiological concerns. But um, anyway, but culture is complicated, so
Yeah, we had a lot of homeschooled kids at Thomas Aquinas. A
yeah, yeah.
lot, a lot, a lot.
I have a question about, so there was a somewhat recent, like 2 years ago, address to the Canon Law Society of America, where the speaker, the keynote, used Lonergan's the experience, understanding, judgment, decision to distinguish the role of the laity and the role of the bishops in terms of who gets to decide things, basically, and he said that the laity can experience and understand things, but it's the role of the bishops to make true judgments and decisions about the future of the church. And wonder how you feel about Lonergan being used in that way.
Hey, girly. Oh, look at this. We have new acquisitions.
Oh my.
Wow, that seems like too many. Okay, give me 5 more minutes and I'll come down. Okay, I'm gonna answer this question, then I'll come down and go help. Go help your mommy. All right, love you. Mwah. It's all right. I went long because you guys weren't here. So, all right, go. I'll be out there in 5 minutes. Go. Psh, psh, psh.
Right, 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's my turn. Go. Get out of here. They went on a target run. Sounds like it was a success. Um, that that way of thinking about it strikes me as a little flat-footed for a few reasons. I mean, part of what it comes down to is how you think about what the sensus fidelium is, which is a pretty, that's one of those like three theologians, five opinions topics. Um, it's up there with the Imago Dei in that regard. Here's why it's, I think, a little flat-footed, though, is that doctrines, in the sense of that which bishops are authorized to teach authoritatively, aren't imminently generated knowledge for Lonergan. They are really, they are kind of this meeting point between the effort to articulate the knowledge born of divine love that comes from above downwards. And then there's a kind of dialectical process where people right, it's the reason you have councils is because even bishops can't always agree about what's authoritative to teach. Um, and so like you have to adjudicate controversies between bishops. Um, and so then that process is guided by transcendental method as well, right? How do you adjudicate the disputes? Well, you go, well, hey, did you think about this passage of scripture? Or did you ask this question? Might be worth looking at the first volume of Lonergan's Triune God texts, Triune God doctrines, to look at how he treats of the pre-Nicene debates. Now that's happening between bishops, and so you don't have a robust sense of the sensus fidelium there. But the bishops are a lot closer to the flock in that patristic period than bishops now, where they're mostly bureaucrats. So it's like I would love for someone to do a really sophisticated Lonerganian analysis of how the sensus fidelium relates to the authorization of bishops to have make authoritative determinations about doctrine and how that relates to the magisterium. I'm not sure that particular application of Lonergan's transcendental method is the most sophisticated way you could do it, and I'm not sure it really fits with Lonergan's overall picture of how it is that divine truths find their way into ecclesial culture and institutions. Someone to ask about that who knows Lonergan is the Canadian ecumenist Catherine Clifford, who's been involved in the synod and so forth. I don't know
Okay.
that she does a ton of Lonergan anymore, but she certainly knows Lonergan.
Thank you.
Yeah, hey, good question. All right, as you can tell, I'm out of time. It's been a pleasure, y'all. I've really enjoyed it. If you think of questions or need more guidance as you keep going with this, shoot me an email. I'm not real hard to find. I will try to respond to you promptly, but I can't promise that I will. Sorry about that.
Jonathan.
Thanks,
Thank you
y'all.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. It's been great. Thank you.
This is great.
Thank
All right,
you.
I'm gonna go bring groceries in from Target.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
Talk to y'all later.
Happy Easter. Take care, John.
All right, happy Easter. Bye now.
Bye.
Easter.